So we're going to go e5, and we will play other openings here as well. Bishop c4, this is called the bishop's opening. We're going to develop our knight and simultaneously attack the pawn. He goes d4. Okay, so this is an interesting move. This essentially opens up the center immediately, and it does attack the pawn. So we're going to just take the pawn, and we're going to try to get him to develop his queen early. He goes e5. That's the theoretical move. Now, this is actually a line, and I actually don't want to move my knight. What you want to look for in such situations when there's a bishop on c4 in these particular openings are ways to develop your pieces and counterattack your opponent's pieces. So the move here is actually d5. I'll talk about this later. The move here is actually d5. He's taken my knight, and I've taken his bishop. Now look what happens as a consequence, guys. Don't worry, I will explain this more slowly later. He gives us a check. Do we have to move our king? Do we have to move our king, or can we block the check? We can't block it with bishop e7, but we can block it with bishop e6. Don't worry, black is much, much better here, because this might look intimidating, guys, because of the pawn he can take. But remember, principles don't lie. If you abide by opening principles, for the most part, and you develop your pieces, and your opponent gives you a bunch of intimidating-looking checks, he ain't going to go far. Again, he's trying to intimidate me. And this is part of the reason that a lot of beginners slip up. They get intimidated by this stuff rather than just continuing to develop. Okay, he finally develops. Now, here's the thing. Would you guys castle short, or would you prepare to castle long? And why? So actually you castle long, because if you castle short, it's very dangerous because he's removed the g7 pawn, which is a vital part of the pawn cover, and he could start threatening checkmate with moves such as knight g5. So we're actually going to castle long. So people get confused. Okay, knight g5, no threats. We're just going to castle, knock yourself out, take my bishop. So he's moving the same two pieces a million times, and he's going to pay a very, very steep price for this if he doesn't castle. He has to castle, otherwise I'm going to kill him down the c-file. Okay? He's playing well. I mean, he's playing, I would say, like a 7-800. Now, we're actually going to move this bishop away and centralize it and just put it on a better square. And depending on what he does, we're going to develop a plan. Now, in terms of attacking his king, can anybody propose a plan? How are we going to actually attack the king? What are we going to do, and on what file? What can you notice? Yes, very good, guys. You're good. So, because he's removed our pawn from g7, that's not only a bad thing, that's also a good thing. We have what's called a semi-open file, which means that only his pawns are on the file. Whoa! Oh, relax! 2 defenders, 1 attacker. This is a great example of when I would not trade, because we are so close to essentially starting an attack against his pawn and his king, and that's going to be a devastating attack, that there is no point in letting him trade. Now, what do you guys think we do here? What do you guys think we do here? We need to do something, and we need to move a piece back to its original square. Let's keep attacking this pawn. Yeah, let's move the bishop back to d5. Let's start pressuring this pawn. Now, we are ready now to move this bishop away, and then we are going to have a devastating attack on the pawn. We're also threatening something super cool. Oh, okay, but he played a5. Now, here's the thing, guys. He wants to play this annoying move a6. So, can we stop that? Can we stop that threat? Can we just deal with this right now? And then we're going to do something beautiful. Can we deal with the... Yeah, let's play a6. And this is called prophylaxis. We don't need to play this move, but it's a good idea to take care of any annoying threats. And we're actually going to do something really beautiful here. Ah, damn, he stopped us. We can actually trap this queen. This is so cool. We can trap this queen. We can trap this queen. Queen h3 almost works, but this is also really cool. How can we trap this queen? Yep, look at this. Bishop f8, trapping the queen. Now, when you see a good move, look for a better one. Is there something even better than taking the queen? Because by playing bishop f8, we've killed 2 birds with 1 stone. We have not only attacked the queen, but we have opened up an attack on the pawn. And here, this is really advanced, but we have checkmate in 2 moves. Who can find me the checkmate in 2? It's better than a windmill. There is actually an immediate checkmate in 2 moves. This is a very advanced concept, but it's an important one. Nobody's seen it yet. It's all checks. Both moves are checks. Both moves are checks. Queen h3, he can stave off the mate. Rook g1. This is a double check. Don't worry, I will explain everything. I am checking him from 2 different sources. When you have a double check, the only way to defend against a double check is to move the king. There's no other way to defend against a double check. And queen g4 is checkmate because the queen is delivering the checkmate and the bishop is basically preventing the king from moving back to h1. The rook is preventing him from moving to either of these 2 squares. Okay, that was an instructive game. Let's talk about it. So basically, in the opening, he played this move e5, okay? Now, what would be wrong with moving the knight away? Well, not only would that violate an opening principle of not moving the same piece more than once, but he could actually pick up the pawn on d4. And simultaneously, he attacks the knight. We have to move the knight again. Danya, I think many people can't keep up with your commentary. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Rashid. I'm really trying my best to explain everything as fully as possible. And also, that's why I'm going over the game afterward. This is a 5-minute game, so I also have to play quickly. And I go over the moments very slowly after the game. I'm trying my absolute best here to essentially make it interesting for everybody. So this would not be good. Now, the move d5 is very specifically, it's fine. I appreciate your guys' support. And I always accept constructive criticism. I appreciate it. And it's totally fine with me. Now, do you guys see that I am also attacking the bishop? Thank you, Spectrum, for the sub. So he can take my knight and I can take his bishop. What do I accomplish by playing d5? Well, what I accomplish is that I open up my bishop and I occupy the center. Now, earlier, I talked about a situation where you have 2 pieces hanging. When you have 2 pieces hanging, you want to think about moving one of the pieces with check, and then, because your opponent has to deal with the check, you can take the other piece. So the move bishop b5 check comes to mind. Does this win a piece? Does this win a piece? Who can answer that question for me? No, why not? Because you can either play c6, or you can actually play the advanced move knight f to d7, dropping the knight back and simultaneously defending it. But don't play knight c6 because then he can already take your knight. Okay. So what he should have done is probably just dropped his bishop back. But then I can already play knight e4. And if you compare this position with this position, you see that there is one fundamental difference, which is that after queen takes d4, the knight is no longer under attack. And you can just essentially develop. You can play bishop e6, defending the pawn, and then you can play knight c6 with tempo. That's why it's a bad idea to develop the queen so early, because you can develop pieces by it and simultaneously attack the queen. Okay, so he can also play en passant, and I think most of you guys are familiar with en passant, and I'm going to use this to discuss the concept of the discovered check. After bishop takes d6, it seems like he can take the pawn on d4. Can he take the pawn on d4, yes or no, and why not if no? Because of bishop b4 check. This is called a discovered check. You expose the attack on the queen. What if he goes c3? What if he goes c3? Bowler, I'll get to your question in a moment. Because of queen takes queen, and you cannot take back because of the pin. Okay? That is also why undefended pieces are so important. Undefended pieces actually might be the most important tactical concept to get your head around as you begin playing chess and as you progress through the first stages. Especially an undefended queen that is x-rayed by the opponent's queen. That is the situation in which you have to be incredibly cautious. Another time that manifests itself is in this kind of situation. When you're castled, the king is on a dark square. There's always the possibility of delivering a check to h2. I've won a lot of games precisely in this way. Okay, so Bowler asked a question about this position. What happens if f3? Do you remember, guys, when I told you that when you move pawns in front of your king, it's almost always very dangerous because it opens up diagonals that the queen could occupy and essentially create big threats against the king. This is exactly such an example. Queen h4 check. In fg3, there is a very typical tactical idea. Most of you have seen this in Puzzle Rush plenty of times, which is where you take on g3. Now, guess what is the oil that makes this machine run? Undefended pieces. Again, because the rook is undefended, you can get away with this and just take the rook, and you're up a million things, and your opponent's position is devastated. I hope that answers your question, Bowler. So he took, I took. The queen e2 check looks scary, but it's nothing. F takes g7, bishop takes g7. I already have 2 pieces developed, and I have an extra pawn, and I have a beautiful pawn chain. He has nothing, and he continues to dig himself further into the hole by moving his queen again. I prepare a long castle, so just to recap, short castle would have been fine, but I didn't want to allow him to create mate threats. I mean, why allow this when I have a perfect home for the king on the queen side? Castle's long, and I played bishop d5. So already at this point, I started developing a plan whereby I will essentially put a rook on g8. I'm going to move this bishop away, and I'm going to try to chase this knight away from g5. And once I crash through on g2, the game is going to basically be over. Just out of curiosity, any reason you chose queen d7 over queen f? Great. Yes, there is. There's 2 reasons. The first is I do not want to allow this kind of move, which pins the queen to the rook. Now, yes, you can play f6, but this blunts the bishop. I want the bishop to be open, and I just don't want to allow the possibility of this. And the second reason is that, let's say he does what he did in the game. I don't want to allow, potentially, the move rook e1 with tempo. Neither of these things are in any way dangerous, but it's all about taking care of your future self. It's all about playing so that you minimize the risk of disaster, okay? Now, you might ask, well, wait a second. Doesn't he have the possibility of that? Well, no, he doesn't, because 2 pieces are defending this square, so knight e5 is not possible. So watch out for tempo plays. That's a great way of encapsulating that, the true Qing. Watch out for tempo plays. So when you develop a piece, watch out for ways that your opponent can develop and simultaneously attack your piece. That's called developing with tempo. Again, that doesn't mean you never try to allow that. Sometimes it's not scary at all. Sometimes you have to allow development with tempo. But when you have a choice, watch out for that. Okay. So he plays a4, making a motion to attack us on the queen side. But he doesn't have any pieces there, so it's not scary. Rook to g8. Knight takes f7 was just terrible. I mean, he does our bidding for us, and he blunders the knight. We just come back to d5 to keep pressuring the pawn. Now, had he played queen a4, I would have had a beautiful move in this position. And in order to find this move, how do I think about this? The first question I ask myself, what would have happened, let's say this pawn were gone. If this pawn were gone, the king would be trapped, which means any check with my dark squared bishop would be made. Next question, can we get rid of this pawn? First move that comes to mind is bishop takes g2. This is a very typical mistake. People follow the logic so far, then they say bishop takes g2. But remember, by sacrificing the bishop, and of course black is still winning, you have relinquished your control over the h1 square. So remember that when you're trying to remove a piece or a pawn, make sure that you're not sacrificing the piece that is responsible for the mating mechanism. And the correct move here is queen h3, sacrificing the queen. Nothing extraordinary, but very nice. G takes h3 is essentially forced. Now we just move the bishop away. White does have bishop g5, but rook takes g5 is checkmate. Okay, so this is not a mythical move. Hopefully I've shown you the kind of logic that can be used to unearth a move like this. There's far more advanced instances of this type of tactic. This is essentially removing the defender or decoy. There's a lot of names for this. That's the idea. Now, by playing queen c5, why has he prevented queen h3? Why has he prevented this move? Or has he prevented it? I know that we trapped his queen, but could we have also done this? This leads me to something that I call the queen syndrome. Yes, Nanuka, very good. Nanuka says queen takes d5, and we don't take the queen, we take the bishop instead. The queen syndrome refers to 2 things, and one of them is when people see a queen hanging, they assume that a queen must be captured. A Bota's gambit can be declined, guys. Remember that. You don't have to take anything, and so people forget that you can take something other than the queen, or you can just ignore a queen sacrifice. That's a very powerful device that we will flesh out a lot more when we talk about defending. I'm going to write this down because I want to keep track of what I've talked about. Okay, so we played bishop f8, rook takes g2. Now, how do you find rook g1 check? Again, the rook is actually an obstruction, okay? I realize that, remember guys, when we asked ourselves the question, what happens if the g2 pawn were gone? It's basically the same thing. The g2 pawn is now gone. The g2 pawn is now gone. So all we need to do is simply get the king back to the g-file, and then we can check him down the g-file, and it's going to be checkmate. The true Ching asks, can you not just back up the rook to g4? Well, not quite, because I can play f3. And this comes back to something I said earlier, which is that you can block a check. Remember that when you're considering a check, you look not only for king retreats, there's no king retreat, aha, it's checkmate, but you can also block a check with pieces, and you need to check for that, get it, when you are considering moves. Now, last thing, would this also result in checkmate? Well, not really, because now the f2 pawn was an integral part of the king being locked in. So if we do the same thing, he can now take the rook. Now, what could we do here? We could go back to g2, and then we could go back to g3, and because there is no longer a pawn on f2, he has to block with a rook, and this is just checkmate. So we could do that. This is called a windmill. This particular device, we could also take all of his pieces, where you essentially check him, then move away with a discovered check, then move back with a check, is called a windmill. There are many famous examples of a windmill. It's one of my favorite tactical devices, and we will talk a lot more about that later, but cash flow real with 10 bucks. Any thoughts on king safety versus keeping up quick piece development in the attack? I find I misprioritize this sometime. Very good question. So cash flow real is asking, how do we know whether to develop a piece or to castle? I don't have, and thank you so much for the 10 bucks. I don't have a shorthand answer for you. I would say that usually castling, here's the thing. Castling is a lot more committal than development, because in virtually any position, you know that development is a good idea, but castling can be very dangerous if it later turns out that the side on which you castle gets opened up or gets exposed in some way. So here's what I'll say. As a beginner, if your rating is, let's say, below 700, your priority should be to castle as early as possible, because it's a lot more important to build good habits than to find exceptions to the rule. You need to learn how to treat your king well, and most of the time, nothing bad is going to happen if you castle a little bit too early. As a relatively advanced player, what you need to start practicing is the concept of flexibility. There are some positions where you want to leave your king in the center for two reasons. Sometimes the king is safer in the center than it is on one side of the board. That happens. And another reason is sometimes you don't know whether you want to castle long or short, and so you delay that decision, but you don't procrastinate too long, but you delay it until things have clarified, until your opponent has indicated on which side of the board he would rather attack, and then you can make an informed decision about where you want to castle. Let's see if I can apply that here. So here would be a great example of that, right? I don't want to castle yet because I know that this side of the board is kind of weak. Now, you might be like, so you wouldn't castle short, but that doesn't answer my question. Well, maybe I would have. If he would have swung his queen to the other side of the board, I might very well have said, okay, now he's not going to attack on the king side. Now I might castle. Yeah, sometimes the king is safer in the middle. If you're an advanced player and you want more information about this, I highly recommend the book, The Art of Attack in Chess. It's an old book written by an IM, I think first published in the 1920s, but there's modern versions. And there is actually a chapter on the king remaining in the center and when you should do that. So if you want to read more about that, highly recommended. Art of Attack in Chess by Vladimir Vuchkovich. You can just search it on Google, get it on Amazon, get it on your Kindle. If you're serious about learning how to attack, one of the best books ever written on attacking chess. Highly recommend it for players, I would say over 12, 1300. Plenty of stuff on attacks.